Coming up on Choppers Politics.
You're going to see more seating, less standing, certainly no standing drinking at the bar in the way that you would see as a traditional hack on Fleet Street.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Choppers Politics. It was a week where the High Street began to reopen, a footballer took on the government and won, and Sir Winston Churchill found himself boxed in Parliament Square. It was also the week where I returned to Westminster for the first time in 3 months, and I'm back in my office right now in the House of Commons, overlooking Parliament Square. Parliament is certainly very strange. There are stickers all over the floor saying stay 2 metres apart, and downstairs in the canteen there's 1 chair per table. And MPs, well, they have to shout at you from 2 metres away. It's very weird. But I'll be keeping my distance as I give my 3 guests a call today, and please do excuse the noise of a busy office in the background. I'll be joined by Chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, to talk about how we can change the conversation about foreign aid. Plus Kate Nicholls from UKHospitality will be telling us why the industry is facing an Armageddon of job losses unless the government gives clear direction on when restaurants, pubs and bars can reopen. But first up, Chairman of the Science and Technology Committee, Tory MP for Tunbridge Wells and former Business Secretary Greg Clark is on the line right now to tell me why the controversial 2 metre rule will drive the UK even further into a recession. Greg Clark, welcome to Choppers Politics. I think you're in rainy Tunbridge Wells today, aren't you?
It's green and delightful, and we need a bit of rain to keep it that way, so no complaints.
The Garden of England, exactly. Now, you're a very experienced MP, now a backbencher. You're chairman of the Science and Technology Committee, and of course, before that, for 3 years, you were the Business Secretary, and before that, President of the Board of Trade. So you know all about government. So let's start with this idea of a 2 metre rule, the 2 metre social distancing rule. Do you think that the government has basically gold-plated this? Because I was talking to one expert who said that the rule should be 1 metre, but the civil servants doubled it to 2 metres because they thought that people wouldn't pay attention in the first place.
Well, I don't know what the origins were of that, but the WHO guidelines, the World Health Organization guidelines, have always been 1 metre, and different countries have taken different views. So France has taken 1 metre, Germany's taken 1.5 metres. We're on the extreme end with a very small number of countries, including Spain. We're at 2 metres. Now, I can understand that in the early days of the pandemic, when we basically pressed the emergency stop button, you had very short notice to take measures that didn't have the time for a great deal of comparative analysis, and I understand the reason for that. But as time goes by, and especially as we start to unlock, I do think you need to make these decisions based on evidence and experience. And we now have a quarter of the year has passed in which countries that have had a shorter distance have had the experience of that. And from everything that we've seen, none of them regret the decisions they've taken. None of them are making moves to increase the social distancing to the UK level. So I think we should be informed, as science should be, by the evidence, and that we should now bring down that limit.
Do you think we've lost sight of what risk means? By that I mean that there's a risk to people's lives, of course, by being infected with the virus, and it lessens the further away you are from someone. There's also a risk to companies, to restaurant firms going bust on Tuesday because they can't pay the rent for the next quarter, to the mental health impact on people affected by that. Do you think we're losing sight of what the word risk should really mean, and we need to take a risk to get this economy going and cut it quickly?
Well, I think we do need to take account of risk, and the point you've made there is right. We're talking about life and death in many cases, and deaths result not just from the direct infection from coronavirus, but from other sources as well. In fact, the evidence that my select committee has been taking, including from the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, acknowledge that you've got people that die from COVID, but you've got people who will die from diseases and conditions that have not been able to be treated during the emergency in the NHS. And then you have another group of people who, if their circumstances change, if they lose their jobs and they're unemployed for long periods of time, we know historically and statistically that is associated with poorer health and higher deaths. So if you want to save lives, then I do think you've got to take a comprehensive approach to this. But what there is clearly a debate and a discussion about, I think, is two things. One is, what is the right judgment given the kind of continuity of risk? It's not that something is completely risk-free and something is highly dangerous. There are judgments to be made there. And there also is this question of communication. The minutes from SAGE show that quite a lot of thought was given to how these things are communicated. And I understand that. And, there is something that is familiar about some of these rules. Stay at home for a while was a very simple message. 2 meters distance is a very simple message. But now we are moving to a phase in which the virus is increasingly able to be isolated into particular places among particular groups. Then I think we need to have more forensic policies to attack it and to eradicate it, rather than relying on these very general broad brush rules that were suitable for the beginning of the pandemic, but not so much now.
Yes, so we might see a more bespoke solution with 2 meters in some places, 1 meter in others, that kind of thing. You, with your Science and Technology Committee Chairman hat on, you've been monitoring this contact tracing app on the Isle of Wight, which didn't launch as planned in June. Do you know what went wrong with it?
We don't know what went wrong, and it would be useful to understand why it hasn't worked. I mean, the Minister, Lord Bethell, who gave evidence to my committee this week, said that it had been a tremendous success, the pilot on the Isle of Wight, but it's not going to be rolled out across the rest of the country, which led me to ask, well, perhaps the success of the pilot was to show that it didn't work and wasn't suitable to be rolled out, which is a success of sorts. It's
he may have meant that.
It's worth knowing that he may have meant that. He didn't. I asked him that, and it wasn't terribly clear what the answer is. But certainly, there's no point rolling something out nationally if you actually discovered on the Isle of Wight that it didn't live up to expectations. That's why you do it. There's a general point that comes out of this. Some things are not going to work in the way that we hoped, and whether that is the contact tracing app, it's okay. We'd hope by now to have an antibody test that was reliable and the scientific knowledge to know that conferred immunity. But actually, we don't have that, and we've got to, I think, front up to that and have the confidence. And I think this applies to ministers, to officials, and scientists to be very open and say this is a new situation we're in. Not everything is going to be done right. The motivation, the intentions are all well-intentioned. Everything is meant well, but we have to be honest and say that not everything is going to work as we hoped. And I think if we do that, I think the public understand that. They can see that. I don't think they need to have a gloss put over that. And an adult and intelligent conversation with the public, I think, is something that would actually command respect rather than confuse.
Are you saying stop treating voters like children, Greg Clark?
Well, it's not I'm saying that we should stop. It's that we should
carry on then.
we should engage voters as rational adults who I think are capable of understanding now, for example, that we're moving into a phase when things will be different in different contexts and different places. And that's because the virus will be more prevalent in particular places. The risks are higher indoors, for example, than outdoors. And so, of course, the rules will reflect that. And I think the public is capable of understanding the reality of the complexity of the situation.
How worried are you about the economy? Do you think we're heading for a depression? Do you think it's going to be an L-shaped depression rather than a V-shaped recovery?
Well, I am worried about it, and of course everyone is worried about it. Obviously, from the perspective I had as business secretary, I know and still talk to a lot of the sectors who are very concerned. And every MP, every constituency MP spends every day talking to very worried businesses in their constituency. And of course, the businesses employ our constituents. So it is a it's a very worrying time. I think the response of the Chancellor with the furlough scheme and other measures of support, I think has been exemplary. I think it was bold and it was timely. Right at the beginning of this, I had an urgent question to the House of Commons calling for a package of support for companies to be able to employ their workers. So I do recognise that was enacted and it was done at pace. So I think the Treasury and I think the Chancellor understand this, and that's important because they showed that they were able to make good judgments on the economy in the early part of the crisis. I hope and expect that same acuity will be demonstrated as we come out of the crisis.
Quite. Just on a different matter now, Greg Clark, as a former business secretary. Overnight we've had reports in the Telegraph of how Green King and Lloyd's of London are paying money to BAME groups because they profited indirectly or directly in the past from the slave trade. Do you think it's right that the corporate side of this country makes amends or wakes up to its past?
Well, I think the investigation that I think you've conducted for the Telegraph has exposed the fact that some companies have received compensation. Now that seems very wrong that they should be benefiting from compensation from the end of slave trading all those years ago. And I think it's a good example that we do need to look back, and where there are injustices, historic as well as current, they should be corrected whenever we can.
Yeah, quite right. Greg Clark, Chairman of the Science and Technology Committee and also a former business secretary, thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. We really appreciate it, and enjoy the weather in Tunbridge Wells.
Thank you very much, Chris. Look forward to talking again, I hope.
Now, one of the many problems companies are facing right now is uncertainty. How they'll reopen, whether customers are going to return if they do, and most crucially of all, when they can open the doors. Now, trade body UKHospitality has been urging ministers for weeks to confirm a date of the reopening of bars, restaurants, coffee shops in England. And here to discuss it is the woman with more insight than possibly anyone else in this whole area, CEO of UKHospitality, Kate Nicholls. Kate Nicholls, welcome to Choppers Politics. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Now, normally you and I would meet in a pub. You are, of course, the Chief Executive of the UK Hospitality Association, but we can't meet in a pub. We're meeting virtually because of this lockdown.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully we will get an announcement and a confirmation from the Prime Minister very soon, hopefully within the next couple of days, that we can go back to meet in a pub safely and with appropriate social distancing from the 4th of July. And I think there's a lot of people around the country and who'll be listening to this who'll be looking forward to being able to do that and going back to their favourite cafe, restaurant, pub, bar, and also go on holiday in the UK.
Absolutely. And just for listeners who haven't maybe heard your messaging, I think you're at the absolute point of the concern about lockdown because of the impact it has on pubs, restaurants and bars. Do you want to quickly explain what that is and why you're so worried about really jobs in your sector?
Well, I think the main point is that we were first into the impact of COVID. Our industry started to feel the effects at the end of January, beginning of February, when international travel and business travel fell off a cliff. And particularly in London, pubs, bars, restaurants suffered a significant decline in footfall throughout March. So we were the canary in the coal mine going into this, and we are obviously going to be the last sector to come out of it. So the effect on our businesses and the jobs and livelihoods who depend upon them is intense. So hospitality is the third largest employer in the UK. 3.2 million people depend on hospitality directly for their job, as well as more through the supply chain. Over the course of Q1, we had a 21% drop in our turnover. That's before we went into lockdown. And the latest GDP figures from government showing a 20% slump. Hospitality accounted for a third of that in March and April, so significantly hit. You've got about 80% of our businesses fully closed and 87% of our people on furlough. Revenues down 95%. So a significant hit to the viability of these businesses. Many don't think they'll survive.
That's right. Well, on that point, there's a threat coming just next week, isn't there? Because a lot of your members pay their rent quarterly up front from the 1st of July, and that falls due next Tuesday.
Absolutely. So we have £1 billion that is due in hospitality rents next Tuesday. Unless the government takes action on that this week, not only will they have to pay that £1 billion for the next quarter, July to September, but they'll also have to pay the backdated rent that hasn't been paid during the period of closure. So a significant hit on incomes when they've got no revenue coming in.
And what's the scale of the damage caused, you think, by companies that can't even tell their landlord if they'll be able to trade in the next quarter starting July 1st?
Well, I think unless we've got some certainty coming out from government on date, the guidelines for opening, social distancing and the terms and conditions under which we'll be able to trade, we've got a third of our premises saying they won't be able to reopen ever. So that's a huge loss of community assets and value.
A third. Now listen, that's shocking. You said there you expect the PM to say something in 2 days' time. Well, today's Thursday and 2 days is Saturday. Why are you saying that?
Well, it's more that if he doesn't say something in 2 days' time, we are going to be forced to press the buttons on handing back keys of leases and starting to make staff redundant because we can't carry on with the level of uncertainty we've got. It's hugely anxious making for many of our people who work in the sector. Mental health and well-being is coming under increasing threat. People don't know whether they've got a job to return to, and people simply can't afford to carry on with the huge cash burn. So they are making decisions within the next 2 days. So the Prime Minister needs to end the uncertainty now.
How many jobs do you think are at stake at the moment? If nothing is said by next Tuesday, how many jobs do you know will be going?
1 million.
1 million?
Yes.
What? But surely not on Tuesday. That's a lot on one day.
Well, you won't hear the announcement straight away on one day, but it'll be progressively over the course of the weeks as people start to go into redundancies. We've already seen the first CVAs of restaurants going. The problem is with hospitality, it's a hidden loss. If a car plant closes, it's a huge number of jobs in one place. For hospitality, 20 to 30 jobs per outlet. They're spread across the country. It's an invisible killer.
You had a round table this week, didn't you, with ministers, I think Paul Scully and Simon Clarke on Tuesday. That's a business minister and a local government minister, respectively. What came from that? Were they listening? Do they get the problem you've got?
I think they do. Ministers are receptive and understanding. Obviously, those ministers look after small businesses, they look after high streets, and Nigel Huddleston, who's the tourism minister, looks after hotels and small guest houses. They all understand the challenge that the industry's got, the need to have confirmation. We are just waiting for the advice to come through from the scientists to determine whether it's safe for us to reopen and whether we can reopen at 1 or 2 metres.
That's right, there are two things. There's the July the 4th opening, which is not guaranteed, and there's the issue of 1 to 2 metres. Now, you've been scoping how life will look in a restaurant or pub or bar. If you're walking in now to the Chopper's Arms, how would it appear to you if you and I were together, walking into a notional pub?
A notional pub, well, I think you're going to have less informality, less spontaneity, because an awful lot of businesses, in order to manage the processes and to manage the social distancing, whatever level it's set at, will be relying more upon pre-booking. You're going to see more seating, less standing, certainly no standing drinking at the bar in the way that you would see as a traditional hack on Fleet Street, many of those small London pubs. And you're going to see a great deal more of at-table service. Over and above that, it's then down to how much space is it, how empty does it look, because you can't manage to have more customers in.
Exactly, and you'll be paying by cash or by card?
Contactless, app. So I think, there's a very real danger that unless we get the social distancing guidelines right, not only will we have an impact on jobs now, but we'll have an impact on jobs in the future as we engineer out service level jobs and we engineer out the hospitality experience unless we're very careful about it. So online payment, online ordering, all of those take away from workforce that is currently employed.
It's a difficult time, isn't it? You really worry. I mean, even with an opening date, you have got this issue of how far you can sit from a mate in a pub. It's difficult to understand how a lot of pubs and bars will survive this.
Well, I think that's the big challenge. But, we have a fighting chance. If we have social distancing at an appropriate level, the difference between 2 metres and 1 metre is the difference between surviving and going under. Because at 1 metre, you will be opening at 70% of your normal revenues, and that gives you a break-even point. So you're just at break-even then. It's still going to be challenging, but you have a fighting chance. If it's 2 metres, Then we know a quarter of our small pubs and bars just simply can't open. They're too small to be viable. And the remainder will be opening at 30% of their normal revenue. So that's well below a loss. There's very little time that they can afford to sustain that. So it is really crucial that we get it right. If we are sticking with 2 metres, then the government does need to provide additional help and support to save those jobs and businesses in the industry.
Kate Nicholls, the CEO of UKHospitality, thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. Thank you and best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Now, there's still more to come on the podcast. Later on, I'm joined by Tobias Ellwood, the Defence Select Committee Chairman, on how aid might change in a post-Brexit world. Right after this.
Hi there, podcast fan. It's Tom Gibbs here. I'm host of the Telegraph's Audio Football Club podcast. I'm very sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to let you know that football is finally back on the menu, and so is Audio Football Club. We'll be back in your podcast feed every Monday with analysis, chat and sarcasm from Mina Rizuki, JJ Ball, Matt Law and many, many more. Look for Telegraph Audio Football Club wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. Now, a politician I know who will have strong views on aid and how Britain projects in a post-Brexit world is Tobias Ellwood, the chairman of the Defence Select Committee and Tory MP for Bournemouth East, and he joins me now down the line. Tobias Ellwood, thank you for joining Choppers Politics. How are you?
Delighted to be here. This is my second time, and I'm thrilled to learn that your audience has tripled in size, so that's fantastic news.
Yes. 3.5 million people can't be wrong. Thank you so much for saying that. That wasn't requested, but thank you. Now, Tobias, you're chairman of the Defence Select Committee, which is important. What's your take on this plan this week announced by Boris Johnson, brought forward from the autumn to merge DFID, the aid department, into the Foreign Office?
Well, one of the reasons why I came into politics was actually to see Britain play a bigger role on the international stage. The world is changing fast. It's in our DNA to be part of global discussions. And I think we should be doing more. We should be punching above our weight. And critically, what our Foreign Office does, what our defence does, what DFID does, and our trade is important. And they must tie together. And I'm afraid those departments are rather siloed. So this is an interesting announcement. Where our aid budget sits has actually been a long discussion going back to Ted Heath's time. The current construct is Tony Blair's, but ultimately it's an important aspect of our soft power. So I welcome this, but I hope that it fits into a wider strategy, because it isn't just about aid. It isn't just about foreign policy. It's also about how security and trade work as well. I'd like to see a grand strategy of us being able to exert influence. So like a pincer movement of helping improve security in a place, helping governance as well, then leveraging trade opportunities there and strengthening the bonds between those nations.
Did you want the aid money to be spent on that? There is some wiggle room if you look at the detail of the legislation in 2015, which allows us to spend 0.7% of our GDP on aid. It allows for movement if there's economic reasons to spend aid money in different ways.
Well, really interesting you say this. I know that your readers have perhaps been concerned about where some of that DFID money goes, particularly when we have floods in the UK. People, quite rightly ask, why aren't we spending some of that money here? Hospitals are demanding it as well. And even when there's a flood or a hurricane in the Caribbean. And this actually goes down to the rules that are made by the OECD on how you can spend that 7%, 0.7%. And one of the things I hope that we'll see is now us either trying one more time to upgrade those rules or actually remove ourselves from the OECD commitments themselves so we can spend it more appropriately. I think your paper covered only a few days ago the fact that, when this started up, Ethiopian dancing girls were getting, aid funds. This is British taxpayers' money. That is completely wrong.
The problem is it's quite hard to spend money when the budget moves through the year because 0.7% goes up, although currently in coronavirus not the case. That means that the budget in the department will move through the year, and by the end of the year you are left with money you have to spend to hit your commitments, and that's often why some choices, not necessarily on the Ethiopian issue, but other choices are made which could be questioned.
Yeah, but this is all technical accountancy stuff. What we should be doing is looking at back to that strategy of how we want to invest in certain programs across the world. Not only that, I've come from a military background. I've been in various operational environments. It's been deeply frustrating. Let's say Afghanistan, where you flush out the enemy, get rid of the Taliban, and then in parts of Helmand, you want to rebuild, you want to regroup, you want to help the local people, but you can't because the military are not allowed to do these things and then claim part of that 0.7% spend. So you then either wait for it to become peaceful enough for DFID programs to start. Remember, they're not armed, they're not able to defend themselves, so they have to wait some time. But during that window of opportunity, it quickly disappears because the enemy regroups and comes back in. So one of the rules I would change is actually let our armed forces be part of that stabilization program, using the money to help redevelop, to stabilize and to move the country forward. Likewise, the rules are quite bizarre. You actually have to wait for a crisis to really emerge before you can start spending that money. What you can't do is actually go in there upstream and then help indigenous capability. Take Boko Haram, taking them on in Algeria, for example. It would be so good for our military to be able to enhance the capabilities before things get out of turn and people start being killed and so forth. And then humanitarian problems come in, and then you can spend the money. So it all needs to be revisited.
And I think what Boris Johnson was telling the House of Commons this week was he wanted the aid money to be used to work in tandem with national interests, and that's why it's been brought back into the Foreign Office. You mentioned there, of course, that it would go back to Ted Heath. I did, that piece you referred to, I wrote in Telegraph. It did, if you look back over the 50-year history of DFID, it basically, whenever Labour came in, they'd make it into its own department, and whenever the Tories came in, apart from David Cameron, it would go back into the Foreign Office because of this concern about where it should sit. We should be using that money to advance Britain's interests rather than to have this conflict on the front line.
Well, really interesting that you should say that, because there is a big point to be made about how influential Britain is abroad. We don't necessarily see it here in the UK, but when you go to the United Nations or you go to these countries in the Commonwealth, they absolutely appreciate the funds that they receive to support them in building up and advancing their country. The fact that we don't see it, we don't talk about it so much, means that aren't aware of that influence.
I know.
As a respected machine of international development, we are in the Premier League, at the top of the Premier League. Where we choose to put our money, other countries follow. And let's not forget, if you don't put that money in there, if you don't support them, their problems can get bigger. And their problems soon become our problems, either indirectly because trade then is problematic, or indeed the people there become so concerned that they depart and then they end up coming to Europe, and they come to Europe, they're going to come across to us as well.
Do you think we need to rethink the way we just think about aid money? I mean, it's something which the country should be proud of, yet it's often criticised, isn't it, in the papers, the Telegraph being one of those papers, and we should think of it differently. I've been writing this week about the issue of companies paying money back to BAME groups because they have some links in the past to slavery. Do you think that we did take a lot, didn't we, from the developing world back in the 19th century and the 18th century, and should we view the 0.7% commitment as a way of giving some of that back into the communities that need it?
Well, I'm really pleased that you raised this, because this whole Black Lives Matter debate is actually putting a mirror up to ourselves, of us finally having a conversation about our past and trying to better reflect it and understand it. And yes, one of the reasons why Britain is so great today, why we have so much power given the size of our country, is because of our past, because of our colonial legacy. And I think we have a duty, a moral duty, if nothing else, to actually help these countries that actually helped us get where we are today. So it's such an important point. I'm really pleased that you raised that.
But don't you think if the government was a bit more upfront about this and said, look, this £15 billion a year, this is us paying back to a degree, not quite reparations, but money, value that we extracted from the empire, we're giving back to countries that need it now. Is that not a good way of talking about that money?
I think it's a healthy way of reflecting it, but I think you also need to look into the future as to what we are trying to achieve here. We are actually trying to be a force for good. We're trying to encourage standards and values and norms and so forth, and develop the British, the democracy that we have here. We want to encourage that in other countries as well. That aid budget helps us achieve that. The point you're raising before is perhaps the British people are not aware of the details of it is very critical. And the role papers like the Telegraph have in playing that is therefore important. We tend to hear when it's poorly spent, we don't hear the benefits of when it is well spent. And, the wars, the insecurity, the destabilization that has been avoided because Britain has led the path, through other initiatives as well, to bring peace and, advancing prosperity in parts of the world.
Tobias Ellwood, of course, as chairman of the Defence Committee, you're very closely looking at this review by John Bew in number 10 Downing Street, this foreign and defence policy review. Where are we at the moment? I think this DFID merger was part of that, wasn't it? But what else are you looking for in that?
Well, this is why I'm curious. I mean, firstly, we're having an enduring emergency. Let's not forget there's COVID-19 that this country is coming to terms with. So I was slightly surprised that this suddenly you're, changing the Whitehall architecture in the middle of that. But secondly, the surprise was the fact that normally a defence, security and foreign policy review would take you into asking those questions as to what Whitehall should look like. What are our global ambitions? What do we want to achieve in the world? What are the bonds that we want to advance? What are the threats that we're going to face? And then work out how much you're willing to spend, what you're actually willing to do. And perhaps that takes you to saying the aid budget should fit in with the Foreign Office budget as well. But they've decided to go ahead with it. We have to accept that that is the case. I want to make sure that the bond between the MOD and what DFID will not be lost. Take Iraq, for example. Great example back in 2003 of the advancement of where DFID has gone. We defeated the enemy there very quickly, but Claire Short refused to spend a penny of DFID money helping reconstruct and redevelop. And guess what happened? The enemy was able to regroup and we were back there a number of years later. And it's been a very painful exercise ever since. Today, that isn't the case. Wherever we go, the military go, it's closely followed behind because of the bonds, the relationship, the strengths. We actually have people, senior DFID civil servants, go to Shrivenham to do the courses there. So they then meet 1-star, 2-star, 3-star generals, developing those relationships so that there is an absolute synergy between warfighting, reconstruction, rebuilding, and peacekeeping.
Do you think this move by Boris Johnson this week is the first attempt by the government to demonstrate that we are now an independent nation following our own rules, really, and interpreting them as we see fit and not relying on supranational bodies to set them for us?
Well, it's interesting you say about supranational bodies. I have a wider concern that the rules-based order that we've enjoyed, that's done us well for the last 40 or 50 years, is now almost past its sell-by date. The UN is now paralyzed because China vetoes many of its votes itself. The World Trade Organization isn't working well. And because of COVID-19, countries are actually retreating away from the global stage. They're cutting their supply lanes. They're becoming more populist, more isolationist. We're in a very dangerous place at the moment, not too dissimilar to the 1930s, when the global architecture, the organizations that are designed to bring people together to sort problems out are not working. And we've got countries rising. I really fear another Cold War with China. And therefore, what Britain does is absolutely critical. We tied up with the United States to create the Atlantic Charter. And I think we have to recognize the dangers that are coming over the hill, the lack of world order. And it's so important that we use our soft power and our hard power status. I hope we won't see a demise in the defense budget as well, because the world that we wake up to post-COVID-19 is going to be far more dangerous, far more complex than the one that we left.
And just finally, Tobias Ellwood, I, like you, have been on this PM plane on overseas trips, the RAF A330 Voyager. It was painted grey with a nice RAF roundel on the side, but now it's going to be repainted in the red, white and blue colours of the Union flag. Is that money well spent? £900,000 of taxpayers' money?
I'm all for patriotism, but I'm afraid I'll just touch on the defence budget. It is overstretched. And when you go to Stonehouse, the Royal Marines base down in Plymouth, and the showers aren't working, 8 Marines in one room, the accommodation is appalling, and they see £900,000 spent on a repaint job, it does not feel right at this juncture, particularly, like I say, when we're facing an emergency. Not only that, this aeroplane now, this Voyager, which is a tactical operational plane. It can refuel typhoons in theaters of war and also could land at Helmand, for example. You're now removing that from the 14 Voyagers that provide that task. At any one time, a number of them are being repaired or in long-term service. Others are forming air bridges. So you're actually taking away an MOD asset. If nothing else, I'd like to see this footed to the cabinet budget, not to the MOD.
There we are. Well, Tobias Ellwood, Chairman of the Defence Select Committee, thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Delighted. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks to my guests this week, Greg Clark, Kate Nicholls, and of course Tobias Ellwood. Thank to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for taking the time to listen to this podcast and clicking play. If you sit there every week and think, what on earth is he talking about when he asks us to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts? How do I do that? Well, please email chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk and we'll tell you. Your reviews really help others find this podcast and know that it exists at all. And if this podcast has left you hungry for more rigorous Telegraph analysis, please go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get 30 days free access to Telegraph's brilliant journalism, completely free of charge. And if you want to read the article that I referred to in the interviews with Greg Clark and Tobias Ellwood, looking at the UK companies' links over the past to slavery, I did it with Dominic Gilbert and Patrick Scott from the UK's data reporting team. We'll leave a link to those articles in the show notes of this episode. And always, if you can, and it's safe to do so, buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You will never regret it. Until next time, cheerio!